You once said that using the debt ceiling as a negotiating wedge just could not happen. You said that when you were in the Oval Office.
That's when I was president.
So why is it different now that you're out of office?
Because now I'm not president.
I would like for you to answer the question.
Okay, it's very simple to answer.
That's why I asked it.
It's very simple to. You're a nasty person, I'll tell you.
Governing is not about entertaining. Governing is not about building a brand or talking on social media and virtue signaling. It's ultimately about winning and about producing results.
So you saw there just a few of the many strange moments from Donald Trump's CNN town hall and the reaction from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in Iowa on Saturday. Let's bring in the roundtable. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, former DNC Chair Donna Brazile, former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, and Democratic Congressman Richie Torres of New York. So, Governor Christie, have to start with you. No secret you are thinking about running for president. How would potential and real candidates against Donald Trump view that performance at CNN and also the reaction of that applauding Republican crowd in New Hampshire?
Well, look, it depends on who the candidate is, right? Now, we've watched a number of declared candidates and almost declared candidates now who all seem to really not know what to do with him. They kind of cozy up to him. They hope that he implodes and that if they're nice to him, that they'll inherit his voters. It's all this like political science classroom theory that they're engaged in, which I think is a losing proposition for any of those candidates, including what Governor DeSantis said.
DeSantis didn't mention his name, to be clear. I mean, he didn't say the words Donald Trump.
You can't beat Donald Trump by playing bumper pool and hitting it off 3 cushions and hope that it goes in the hole. That's not the way it works, John. And I think they're all making a marked mistake. As to the audience reaction, let's face it, CNN went in the tank to get Trump on there. They allowed him to negotiate who was going to be in that audience. And those were all Trump supporters. I don't care how they introduced them. I know a lot of those people in that audience. I spent a lot of time in New Hampshire 8 years ago, and a lot of those are the same faces that I saw 8 years ago. Though you pay no attention to the audience reaction. Those were all people who, in the main, 80% or so were Trump supporters. So that was a negotiation deal that Trump did with CNN, and I think CNN was wrong for doing it.
Donna?
Well, it was entertaining.
As a former CNN contributor?
Well, I'll say now what
She's been everywhere. You can't even tag that on her.
I'm still a silver fox, okay? Be careful. Look, it was entertaining. It was disgusting at the same time, because this is a guy who continues to repeat the same lie after lie, somehow believing that it's going to become true, that the election was rigged. It was even more devastating to hear that he might consider pardoning the people who attacked the citadel of our democracy, the Proud Boys.
And he made it clear most of them. It wasn't like just a few here or there.
I mean, but that was vintage Donald Trump. He want to stick it to us. He want to, make us pay for our sins. But Donald Trump is the perfect candidate. Look, I don't know, Governor, if hitting Donald Trump will somehow or another, deflate his base. He seems to have an appetite for this moment. He seems to know what he's doing in terms of projecting that he is the guy to be. Ultimately, the Republicans will have to decide if they want to repeat the past or go ahead and start focusing on the future.
But, I mean, it's not just the audience, Governor Hogan. I mean, the guy has widened his lead.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that's really most concerning is that, he packed the audience, certainly, and CNN allowed him to do that, which you probably should question CNN for how that happened. But it's not just them. I mean, he's got 50-some% of the Republican base, and that's what Governor Christie and I are trying to make the case that we've got to move in a different direction, that we've got to move on from Trump. And we've just got to see some candidates step up and get out there and make the case about why we've got to do that. You talked about Ron DeSantis coming in. I mean, he's been trying to out-Trump Trump, and that's not going to work. I mean, it's like, why would you settle for, Robin when you can have Batman? It's like, you've got to take Trump on and not just be a younger, smarter version of Trump.
And Congressman Torres, we had a speech also yesterday, a commencement speech from Joe Biden, Howard University. Made what seemed to be a pretty grave tone, talking about there are those who demonize and pit people against one another, and there are those that will do anything and everything, no matter how desperate or immoral, to hold on to power. I mean, how do you look at the threat of Trump? second time around, third time around?
I mean, Donald Trump is the Freudian it of the Republican Party. He represents what's worst about American politics. And the person we saw at the town hall is exactly who Trump is, always has been and always will be. And so we should stop being surprised by the vulgar and crude snake oil salesmanship of Donald Trump. What I found notable is that even though he loves name calling, he conspicuously refused to call Vladimir Putin a war criminal. He conspicuously refused to say whether he wants Ukraine to win in the war. So here you have a likely Republican presidential nominee whose moral compass is so broken that he's more offended by a CNN host than he is by a war criminal like Vladimir Putin.
And he actually said he doesn't like to talk about winning or losing.
Yeah, well, that's all he talks about. And you know, look, I think the congressman is right in the sense that, you know, people are talking about kind of the show, the Trump show, and how offensive that was. What I think is even more offensive about what I saw at that town hall was what he was saying about the important issues that are facing the country right now. You know, certainly your point on Ukraine, I think, is extraordinarily important. But also that he would allow default unless there were serious cuts. Where were the serious cuts in the 4 years of the Trump administration? In the 4 years of the Trump administration, he left with the biggest budget deficit of any president in American history. He added more to the debt at that time than any president in American history. This is a guy who says one thing and does another. But I remember back to 2016, John, and you'll remember this too. He said he was the king of debt.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden he wants to be the king of budget cuts. It doesn't make sense. But Governor Hogan's right. Until somebody's out there and taking it to him, this is all being done in a vacuum.
So is that going to be you?
I don't know. But I'll tell you this, someone better do it.
Hey, I've been taking it to him for 6 years, but we've got to get some people in this presidential race.
Yeah, it's in the ring. You've got to get in the ring and do
Yeah.
it. And you have to get in the ring and do it and take the risk that goes along with that.
So what's holding you back?
You know, John, these are tough decisions. And if you want to run for president, you can do it too.
Hey, let's fish or cut bait.
What was that?
Let's get done. Let's get this done.
Well,
Yeah, can you raise-
We want to see you in that
We can
ring.
make this happen right here.
I know, John, you know, I know I couldn't. As
Yeah.
persuasive as you are, I'll take a pass at the moment.
Put the pressure on right now. 40,000. Can you get 40,000 donors? Can you get your approval rating up to 1% so that you can debate? You just did several Facebook ads attacking Donald Trump for saying he refuses to debate. Now, the question is, if you're ready to debate Donald Trump, then you should be prepared to run against him right now.
But here's the
Okay,
dilemma.
maybe not me. Donna just did.
You know, I think it's interesting
But
that Donald Trump refuses to debate the Republican challengers and that President Biden refuses to debate the Democratic challenger. You know, when would you ever see the two top candidates
But
refuse
here's the
to debate?
dilemma. The more crowded the Republican field, the more advantageous to Donald Trump, because there is a significant segment of the Republican electorate who is unwaveringly loyal to Donald Trump. He's the god that they worship.
Which is the point that I made when I decided not to run, that I didn't want to see a multi-car pile-up, that we have too many candidates and do the same thing we did in 2016. But I don't think too many people are following that advice. Looks like a lot of folks are going to be jumping in.
But we're a long way from voting. So, I mean, you know, people can drop out before Iowa, before New Hampshire.
It's far too early. I mean, if you think back to 2016, a year before the election, all we were talking about was Scott Walker and Jeb Bush, and Donald Trump wasn't on the horizon. So everybody's talking now about Trump and DeSantis, but it can change. I mean, somebody's going to rise up, and it's a long way from the election.
And look, John, the other thing, Donald will remember this back to 2007. In May of 2007, Barack Obama was 42 points behind Hillary Clinton. 42 points behind Hillary Clinton. Campaigns matter. And all this stuff we're talking about Donald Trump right now, and even Ron DeSantis to an extent, is all theoretical. It's all classroom stuff. When a campaign starts, things happen. People start talking and interacting with each other. Mistakes get made, or, in fact, there's an MRI of somebody's real soul.
But do you think he doesn't debate, though? Do you think he said that he had no reason to debate?
His ego will not permit him not to be on that stage. There cannot be a TV camera on.
He's already skipped one debate. I remember back in 2016 in Iowa, he skipped the Fox debate.
He petulantly skipped one debate, and in the end, though, he was at every other debate because he believes, I can tell you this from being the guy who prepped him for debates in 16 and in 20, he believes he will win every debate he's in. And that ego part of him will prevent him from skipping.
And we've got to take a break, but Congressman, to Governor Hogan's point, I mean, there are two challengers to Joe Biden right now. Maybe they're not concerned about either one. Robert Kennedy Jr., Marianne Williamson. Do you think we'll see more? I mean, Biden is looks historically weak in polls anyway.
I think President Biden's going to overwhelmingly dominate the Democratic primary, and we feel that he's had one of the most productive and productively bipartisan presidencies in recent history. So he has a smooth path. We're a much more functional party than the alternatives.
Well, you know, I would say that the likely nominees in both parties, about nearly 70% of the people in America, do not want to see a rematch, and they do not want Joe Biden or Donald Trump to be president.
And they'll be 160 years old.
Why would you apply for unemployment benefits when you had a job making $120,000 a year?
Rachel, this is part of my defense. This is inaccurate information, and I will get to clear my name.
Are you planning on running for re-election?
Yes, I am. I will prove myself innocent, and then we'll move from there. And re-election is a very far time away from it.
That was our Rachel Scott questioning George Santos after his arrest this week. The congressman is as defiant as ever and pleading not guilty to 13 charges, including wire fraud, money laundering, stealing public funds, and lying to Congress. The roundtable is back. So you're a Congressman Torres. You are a fellow congressman from New York. Is Santos going to make it through this? Is he going to be expelled? What's going to happen?
He should be expelled. As a politician, he's done more law-breaking than law-making, and he should be in prison rather than Congress. But for me, George Santos is not only a scandal unto himself, he's a symptom of a diseased Republican Party that has become a cesspool of conspiracy theorists like Marjorie Taylor Greene and clowns like Lauren Boebert and charlatans like Donald Trump and crooks like George Santos. And the Republicans who refuse to expel him are enabling him.
Governor Christie?
Well, I don't know that I agree with all of that, but what I would say is that George Santos doesn't belong in Congress. I mean, he didn't belong in there in the first place. And then when you find out all the lies, all the rest that he's done, and the shifty maneuvers and illegal conduct as alleged by the indictment, look, I'm not ready to say he needs to go to jail because I think everybody's
got a right to defend himself
until proven guilty. And having done this for 7 years, the government needs to go and prove their case.
Yeah.
But that's different than whether or not he should be sitting as a representative in Congress.
So there should be a vote to expel him?
Look, I would certainly expel him. If I were a member of Congress, I would vote that way. You know, probably leadership is going to have to decide how they want to do that, and politics is going to get involved in this, John, with as narrow a margin as they have. They'll probably let the process play out. So I think you can divide the two of them. I don't know if he's a criminal, but he's certainly a liar. And if he turns out to be a criminal, then he belongs going to jail.
He pled guilty to theft. Yes,
he just pleaded guilty in the country named after my family, Brazil. Okay? He pleaded guilty.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, you know, you should check us out sometime. But look, he pleaded guilty. He's lied about his mother. He's lied about his wealth. He's lied about his job, his college. I mean, the list goes on. I mean,
look,
yeah,
Donna,
who lies about volleyball, Chris?
Donna, I'm not defending George Santos. All I'm saying is that our Constitution applies to everybody. So he doesn't belong in Congress. I've been clear about that. But we also need to let the process play out. Let him have his opportunity to defend himself. Even he got it wrong on the tape. I was kidding with the congressman. He said, I'll prove myself innocent. No, George.
That's right.
You're presumed innocent. The government has to prove you guilty. If they prove him guilty, he belongs to go into jail.
You will pretend to be a lawyer, #1 graduate from Harvard. You never know what's going to happen. I said it once, and I'll say it again. He's a stain on the United States Congress, and he should be expelled. But since that will not happen, I do believe the law will have to take its course. And once again, he'll continue to lie. He's taking the worst chapter from the former disgraced president of the United States and calling this a witch hunt. No, these are serious charges that he's been accused of.
Governor Hogan, he also voted 15 times for Kevin McCarthy to be Speaker. And on that 15th time, he was the deciding vote, as anybody who voted for him was. It was a one-vote margin.
Well, that's probably not a crime.
but I mean, I mean, McCarthy has to think twice before. I mean, he hasn't called on him to resign. He has said he wouldn't endorse him for re-election. He has taken him off his committees.
Right. Well, I mean, there's no question. This is the guy's a clown, and he's obviously, got all these criminal potential charges out there. I agree with Governor Christie. He's got a right to prove himself in a court of law, and they've got to prove him guilty. But if I were in Congress, I would say we got to get this guy out of here. He shouldn't be in Congress. And but somebody's going to replace him in that district, even if they did remove him. So Kevin McCarthy would likely still have that vote. It's not going to impact that.
Do you? Well,
I disagree with that.
It would probably be a Democrat that
I
would
think
replace him at this
clearly
point.
the decision to protect George Santos is driven not by principle but by politics. Right? Kevin McCarthy needs every vote that he can get, and he needs George Santos. George Santos was the decisive vote on the Republican bill to default on America. And what I find hypocritical is the Republicans ran on a platform.
They would call that the bill where they raised the debt ceiling.
But I find it hypocritical that Republicans ran on a platform of draining the swamp, yet are insisting on protecting George Santos.
Well, let's remember that the only party who has already passed a bill saying they would raise the debt ceiling is the Republican Party. The Democrats in the Senate could do the very same thing. Chuck Schumer has not done it. He's refused to do it. And Joe Biden is off in Rehoboth, Delaware this weekend. I mean, he should be at the White House negotiating with Kevin McCarthy and Republicans to get a raise to the debt ceiling. Instead, for I don't know how many times now he's been to Delaware. He seems like he spent more time in Delaware than in Washington.
Let's be honest. Delaware is a beautiful state. It's a beautiful state.
I went to college there. I love it.
Donna, almost out of time. Last thought.
The staff, they're negotiating.
Where's Joe?
He was at Howard University yesterday. Joe? They're negotiating, and I do believe America will pay its bill. We will not default.
Where's Joe?
But it's not a normal negotiation. It's an extortion.
All right. We are out of time. Thanks again to the roundtable.